A look inside aviation with Phil Durner. The safest seat on a plane. Why the tail isn't always the best bet. A look at 10 aviation accidents that both support and debunk the common ideas about where the safest seat is. In the tail is what someone who's listening in always shouts out before I have a chance to answer this common question. Sure, the tail can be called the strongest part of the aircraft. Simplified, you have a metal structure narrowing to a point in the tail cone, built to withstand a variety of forces that include the weight of the tail above it and the lateral forces that tail exerts, along with the need to handle the threat of tail strikes on both takeoff and landing. While the idea that the tail has opportunities for safety isn't entirely wrong, it's largely outdated and doesn't reflect the most common life-threatening accidents we see today. What we saw in Kazakhstan and South Korea. Two devastating airline accidents marked the end of 2024, both caught on video, and both becoming examples that left many to wonder if the tail of the aircraft is the safest place to be. The first accident was on Christmas Day, when Azerbaijan Airlines Flight 8243 was en route from Baku, Azerbaijan to Grozny, Russia. For reasons still unknown, this aircraft was struck by a Russian-fired anti-aircraft missile, which crippled the Embraer E-190 jet. Despite the crew's valiant efforts, after making it successfully across the Caspian Sea, they fell short of the airport in a large explosion on their second approach to Aktau International Airport in Kazakhstan. Incredibly, 29 of the 67 occupants survived, with several simply walking away. The aircraft broke apart in impact, but the rearmost section remained largely intact and avoided fire damage. Post-crash video suggests this section was where most of the survivors were located. Just days later, on December 29, Jeju Air Flight 2216 attempted a gear-up landing at Muan International Airport in South Korea. The aircraft overran the runway at high speed, impacting a berm that housed an array of instrument landing system towers. That impact, also captured on video, was extraordinarily violent. With 181 people on board, it was a surprise to learn that even two had survived. Both of them were flight attendants, secured in their rear galley jump seats at the tail of the aircraft. Question: why don't we all get the same types of 5-point seatbelts that flight attendants have? Answer: because people don't understand how to use them and certainly will not know how to get themselves out of them when evacuating an aircraft. You know how flight attendants tell you how to use a seatbelt during the safety briefing on every flight? Sure, Jerry Seinfeld has jokes about it, but keep in mind that our car seatbelts operate with a button release, and aircraft lap belts operate with a latch. The difference matters. There have been several accidents where disoriented passengers were incapable of undoing their simple seatbelt and died as a result. That's why we hassle you about it before every flight, to cram it into your muscle memory. The holiday season accidents were strong arguments for sitting in the tail, an idea supported by other events in aviation history. Ghosts of air disaster past. In January 1982, Air Florida Flight 90 struggled to gain altitude after departing Washington National Airport during a snowstorm. Ice had caked its wings and engine, leaving the aircraft unable to climb. Floating in a stall, it clipped the 14th Street Bridge before plunging into the Potomac River. In a daring icy rescue by a U.S. Park Police helicopter, 5 of the 79 people aboard survived. All were seated near the tail, which had separated from the rest of the plane. In 1989, United Airlines Flight 232, operated by a McDonnell Douglas DC-10, experienced a catastrophic failure of its center engine, which is housed within the aircraft's tail. The uncontained engine failure caused debris to be ejected, and an unforeseen design flaw, since corrected on modern aircraft, allowed shrapnel to sever all 3 of the aircraft's hydraulic lines. This left pilots unable to control the plane using normal inputs to turn, climb, or descend. Similar to what we are likely to learn from the investigation of Azerbaijan 8243's crash, the United crew used differential thrust from the 2 remaining engines to steer the aircraft. Also similarly, the heroic pilots brought the plane close to an airport, giving passengers a chance of survival. The crash ultimately resulted in a large, fiery wreck, an event captured on video, which was exceedingly rare in the late 1980s. The DC-10 broke apart into 5 distinct sections, with the tail being one of them. This section sat 13 people, and 11 of them survived. But the tail wasn't the only source of survivors. Each broken-off section yielded different results. A majority of the fatalities occurred in the rear half of the main passenger cabin and in the first-class area. The flight deck and the 11 rows behind first class saw nearly all survivors. In total, 184 of the 296 people aboard lived. The modern era. You might have noticed that my previous examples are from the 1980s, at least when it comes to accidents in the United States. Let's take a more recent look, and you'll begin to understand why I don't buy into the tail seat theory. Recent is a tricky term, as the last fatal passenger airline crash in the mainland United States occurred 11 years ago in July 2013, a stark contrast to the high fatality accidents we saw almost every year through the 1970s and 1980s. In that last incident, Asiana Airlines Flight 214 descended below the glide slope due to pilot error, falling short of the runway. The tail struck the seawall and separated from the aircraft, while the rest of the Boeing 777 slammed into the ground violently and spun to a stop, thankfully without an explosion. There were 307 people aboard, and 3 of them perished, all 3 seated in the back rows of the aircraft. In this case, sitting in the back offered no advantage. In fact, you'd have to go back nearly 30 years to August 1995 to find the last fatal mainland U.S. passenger crash in which passengers sitting near the tail survived while those in other sections did not. That example is Atlantic Southeast Airlines Flight 529, which occurred after departing Atlanta, Georgia. The crash of the smaller Embraer EMB 120 was caused by metal fatigue on a propeller. All 26 passengers survived the impact, but 8 perished in the ensuing fire, all seated in the front of the aircraft. In this case, the death toll had less to do with the tail strength and more to do with the ability to evacuate the aircraft. Asiana 214 also had a major post-crash fire, but everyone was able to evacuate. The current threats. Although the mainland U.S. hasn't had a fatal airline crash in over 11 years, we have certainly had crashes and major fires. It's just that we've made significant strides in improving survivability. In 2015, major fires occurred on British Airways Flight 2276 in Las Vegas, Dynamic Airways Flight 405 in Fort Lauderdale, and then American Airlines Flight 383 in Chicago in 2016. While the fires were all extinguished quickly, aircraft damage in all were substantial, and the key to surviving in those massive fires was evacuating. Stepping overseas for a moment, and with the caveat that Russia isn't exactly a model of aviation safety, May 5, 2019 provided a horrifying example of a fiery evacuation, again captured on video. Aeroflot Flight 1492 crashed on landing in Moscow during a series of pilot errors. The main gear of the Sukhoi Superjet 100 collapsed on touchdown, and before the aircraft had even slid to a stop, flames had already engulfed it, towering to twice its height. A bottlenecked evacuation through the 2 front exits were the only option, likely contributing to the high fatality rate of 41 out of the 74 aboard. Once again, evacuation is key to survivability. Exit strategy. Looking at recent history and how plane crashes tend to unfold these days, I believe the safest seat on the aircraft is in the exit row or very close to an exit. While accidents are exceptionally uncommon, when they do happen, the more likely scenario beyond an immediate all-fatal impact is one where you'll need to evacuate yourself quickly. Consider your seat choice as a part of your personal safety strategy. Know where the nearest exits are, both ahead of and behind you, and count the rows to each. Pay attention to the safety briefing, review the safety card, and visualize the hand movements required to operate the different exit doors, as if you had to do it with your eyes closed. While it's easy to tune these things out, in the off-chance moment when seconds count, being prepared can make all the difference. The U.S. airline industry's safety culture has evolved to make crashes increasingly rare and usually very survivable. Odds are you'll be fine, but plan to get out. Thank you so much for listening.